I've put together this video to introduce you to a script analysis technique called a plot bead diagram. A plot bead diagram is a method for making a visual guide to a play, or to a section of a play, and it is a powerful tool for both understanding the structure of a play and for making artistic decisions about how to take a play from page to stage. In this video, I'll begin by introducing you to the ideas of Robert Scanlon, who has taught plot beading to several generations of students at Harvard and who recently published a book, Principles of Dramaturgy, that outlines his method. I'll follow that by showing you some examples of plot bead diagrams from his book. Then, I'll demonstrate how to make a plot bead diagram, using the short play Trifles as my example. Finally, I'll wrap up by explaining a variation on the plot bead diagram that was devised by Shelley Orr, a professor at San Diego State University, who put her own spin on Scanlon's method. Scanlon introduces the plot bead diagram by way of asking us to consider what it is we mean when we talk about theatrical form. This is actually a tricky question. What exactly do we mean when we talk about form in the theater, and how do we see the relationship between form and content? In order to get at that, Scanlon asks us to think about form in the realm of sculptural art. For a sculptor like Michelangelo, the raw material of the craft is an enormous block of marble. The sculptor shapes or forms the material in order to create the work of art, in this case, the David. So what, Scanlon asks, is the raw material of the theater artist? As the 18th century playwright and critic Gotthold Ephraim Lessing noted in drawing a distinction between the visual arts and the performing arts, the salient difference between these two arts is that visual arts are not bound by time. You can look at a painting or sculpture for as long or as short as you'd like, but performing arts, dance, music, and theater are time-bound arts. And that means, Scanlon observes, that the raw material of the performing arts is time. Now, the first time I read this, I was like, the insight here, and it's a crucial one, is that as theater artists, we are sculpting the viewer's experience of time. The craft of theater as an art is to carve an hour or two of unfashioned time into something aesthetically and emotionally impactful. Every play has a temporal form that must be crafted with care, and serious theater artists need to be able to distinguish between the temporal form, or the plot of the play, and its content, which is usually, but not always, the story. What's the difference between plot and story? Well, the story of a play, its content, is usually the answer to the question, what was it about? Our little example play, Trifles, is about a pair of women who solve a murder by attending to trifling clues. That's the story. The plot of a play, as Aristotle already distinguished almost 3,000 years ago, is the arrangement of incidents or events over time. In the theater, the order in which we see events, the length or duration of each event, the way that they build on each other, their relative emotional weight to each other, this constitutes our form, and it's different from the story. As Scanlon puts it, in the theater, we make our artifacts primarily out of ongoing units of time. We contrive our packets of duration such that audiences are swept along by a time form that is, we hope, under our artistic control. Audiences cannot stop the show for a second pass. This is the deepest principle of form in the drama. It's important to remember that an audience can't rewind. Each moment of time builds on the one previously, and it leads to the next one. So, time is our material. There's a lot more in Scanlon, and if you're interested in reading what he says about form and the plot bead diagram, you can find the chapter in Canvas, in Files, or linked to the asynchronous class instructions. So, Scanlon developed the plot bead diagram as a way of training theater practitioners to attend to that arrangement of incidents over time. A plot bead diagram is essentially a tool, a visual device, to chart the time form of a theatrical plot. Scanlon named the plot bead diagram by way of an analogy with a necklace. A plot bead diagram is like a sequence of individual beads, each one representing a time event, strung on a timeline in the order in which they occur in performance. Here are some examples of what they look like. As you can see, the aim is to get the entirety of the play onto one sheet of paper. The plot bead diagram consists of a series of simple shapes arranged vertically, each shape representing a time unit or time event of the play. Size is used to represent either duration of time, so larger shapes for longer scenes, or to represent emotional weight, that is, key moments also take up more space. Entrances and exits are marked with arrows, and shapes can also be used to make distinctions between types of scenes. Rectangles for monologues here, for examples, and circles for scenes, and he's used jagged shapes for moments of high conflict. Hinges between beads can be used to indicate transitional moments. Other graphic indications, like shading, might be used to show that an event or time unit of the play seems to have two parts. You can see from these examples that the graphic representation of the play will vary. There isn't a right way to do this because the process of doing it, of making decisions, of putting pencil to paper and thinking about where a given moment seems to have ripened, where a scene has moved into a transitional moment, where an interruption merits a new bead and where it simply splits a bead in half, all of these are artistic decisions that help the person making the diagram understand the play, and also to understand how they might want to stage the play. Here's a final example. This is the storyboard drawn by director Robert Wilson for his work Einstein on the Beach, which is a work that doesn't actually tell a story in the traditional sense. So this is a work in which the form is the content. There isn't really a story content to the piece. And here is Scanlon's plot bead diagram of the piece. And you can see that Scanlon discerned a pattern of form in the work, much like we might see form in an abstract painting or sculpture that lacked representational content. Your plot bead doesn't have to be black and white. You can also use color to indicate mood, theme, character, or pattern. So here I've taken Scanlon's diagram of the Wilson work and added color to make the pattern more visible. And now we can see that there is an ABC pattern with these transitional moments, what they call the knee plays, indicated by K1, K2, K3 in between. And you can see that there's a repeating pattern that constitutes the form of the play. So now I'm going to turn to demonstrating how to do a plot bead diagram. And if you haven't already read Trifles, I suggest you pause this video and read the play before continuing. It's a rather short play. It shouldn't take you more than 20 or 25 minutes to read. And in the next section, you're going to see me demonstrate how to do a plot bead diagram of Trifles. Okay, so the first step in making your plot bead diagram is to annotate your script and to make some decisions about where units of action begin and end. So I've read this play a few times. I've actually already made some decisions about this, so I'm going to go very quickly through this. But when you are doing your own plot bead diagram, you're going to actually have to take a bit more time to read through the script, read it carefully, sort of make some artistic decisions about where you think a moment of action sort of ripens and ends, where the interruptions are, whether or not they are sort of an interruption of a beat or the end of a beat, all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to go pretty quickly, and you may or may not be able to read my handwriting, but that's okay because I'll be also doing this again on the plot bead diagram. So Trifles begins with the entrance of the characters, and so we have the men entering and then the women, and we begin with this kind of sort of establishing scene in which we find out that the house is empty and it's cold. And that scene goes to about here. And then we have this next scene that starts about here is where Mr. Hale tells the county attorney what happened, right? So Mr. H tells what he found. And this segment of the play continues for quite a bit. And this is really a lot of exposition. It kind of sets the scene for what happened. And this goes all the way here. And this ends right about here. We have a kind of transition. and we kind of have a sort of nothing here but kitchen things, which kind of establishes the theme of the play, and we transition into the discovery of, here's a nice mess, discovery of the fruit that's been exploded and the dirty towels. So we have a kind of, the county attorney starts to disparage Minnie's housekeeping, right? And that goes to about here when Mrs. Hale kind of pushes back on the county attorney, and he then starts to question Mrs. Hale. And this interrogation or this questioning goes to about, let's say here, where the county attorney says, now I want to go see upstairs, and we kind of transition into the men's exiting, and we can trust Mrs. Peters as part of that exit, that transition. So trust Mrs. P as part of that transition, and the men exit right about here. And this moment, when the men exit and leave the women alone, begins what I think is sort of the main segment of the play, right? Which is the action consists of the two women in general sort of speculating, gossiping, prodding, and poking around Minnie's house, and doing kind of their own investigation, although they don't know that they're doing an investigation at this point. And so this is this is the main action of the play, and I'm probably going to map this out as one big bead. And the very first part of it is quite long. It goes all the way through here and all the way through here. And really, it kind of is first sort of interrupted, or the first kind of maybe sort of major thing that happens is right here. There is the discovery of the quilting basket. And this is the first kind of thing that they find that's a little bit unusual. And we have a very brief interruption where the men return, right here. The men return, and they tease the women, and then they leave. So there's this just sort of very brief interruption, and then the women continue to do their observation and investigation. And we then have another kind of sort of big moment, or big sort of sort of thing that we want to flag perhaps, which is that we have the discovery of her nervous stitches, right? So where she's got her stitches are all over the place, and she didn't know what she was about. So this is the discovery of the stitches. And I'm going to call this clue number 1. And then we have another sort of moment of clue, which is the discovery of the bird cage. And I'm going to call this clue number 2. And I'm going to mark this, and I'm going to mark it in a way that sort of shows that it's still part of this main action, but that it's also kind of a milestone in the play and in the progression of the action. And of course, the birdcage also has a broken door. And then we still have this sort of, they kind of talk a little bit about the birdcage through here. So this is sort of a bit of a scene right here. And then we have the women start to talk about Minnie, and especially about John, and kind of what a sort of cold and mean man he was. And so we have kind of a sort of bit of gossiping here about that. And then right here we have now the third clue, which is the discovery of the bird. This is clue number 3. And they are then interrupted by the entrance of the sheriff and the county attorney. So the men return. And once again, they tease the women. Have you decided to quilt it or knot it? They're trivializing them. And the women actually, interestingly, sort of cover up, and they sort of lie a little bit about whether or not there was a bird. And then the men here leave again. And leaving the women alone. And now there's a sort of, I think that there's a new sort of action that begins here, because at this point, the women begin to share an understanding of Minnie's pain. And crucially also, they start to kind of wonder about whether or not, what justice is going to look like here, right? So they're having a transitional moment for themselves of kind of really starting to sympathize with Minnie's trauma and Minnie's pain. And that continues all the way through here until the men return again. And when the men return, they're talking about sort of, if only we had a motive, right? Which the women overhear. And then we have a small sort of transition moment where there is a kind of cursory inspection of what the women are going to give to Minnie, bring to Minnie. And there's a sort of nothing dangerous here. I think that's right here. Actually, nothing dangerous the lady have picked out. And then the men exit again. And while the men are gone, the women hide the bird. And this is a big moment for them, even though it's a very brief moment in time. And then the men return. And once again, they're trivializing the women. And we have this little sort of bump where she answers, when he teases her about, is it knotted or quilted? She says, "Not it, Mr. Henderson." And there's this kind of clever pun that is happening in the play, because if you think about it, what we hear is not it, right? The men are not getting it. So I have now sort of taken the script and I have annotated it and made some markings, and now I'm going to turn to a blank piece of paper. Actually, I'm going to do this on the iPad, and I'm going to draw out the plot bead diagram that this annotation and this kind of breakdown of the script seems to imply. So I will be right back with that. Okay, so now that we've done our annotation of the script, we're going to turn to making a plot bead diagram. So if you remember, the first thing that happens in this play is that the characters enter. So entrances are usually marked by arrows. So we're going to make ourselves an arrow here, and we'll label it men enter, then women. And if you recall, our sort of first bit of action, or the first thing that happens, we have this kind of prologue where the house is cold and kind of establishes the scene. And then we have the kind of establishing exposition scene, or the kind of backstory, where Mr. Hale tells the county attorney what he saw when he got there. And that gives us the story of sort of the fact that John is murdered, and that Minnie was found in the rocking chair. Then the county attorney starts sort of poking around the kitchen, and we have this little bit of a transition. It's like, nothing here but kitchen things, blah, blah, blah. And that leads Mrs. Hale to defend Minnie. And, oh, wait, no, before that we have, the discovery of the exploded fruit, right? And of the dirty towels. And the county attorney's disparagement of Minnie's housekeeping leads Mrs. Hale to defend her, and that kind of prompts the county attorney to question Mrs. Hale. And Mrs. Hale kind of answers his questions, and then the men decide that their investigation needs to go upstairs where the murder occurred. So the men exit upstairs. And, you know, there is we can trust the sheriff's wife, Mrs. P. So, you know, we already have a kind of trivializing of women's concerns and women in general. And then, so now the women are alone. And as I said when I was doing the annotation of the script, I kind of see this next sort of big section of the script to be all of one whole. So I'm going to make a sort of really, really big circle. And you may notice that I am drawing on top of a sketch that I previously made. And that's because I actually don't trust myself to draw and talk at the same time. But you may also want to make a pencil sketch of your plot bead diagram before you sort of, you know, do it in ink, because you may want to, you know, erase stuff. You might want to make some changes. It's a good, you know, sketching these out, the act of sketching, the act of drawing it can help you make decisions. And so doing a draft of it first, also kind of getting the placement on the page can be really tricky. You know, you might find yourself sort of running out of space, or the whole thing is too crowded at the top, so you may want to do it over. So it's a good thing to do a sort of, you know, preliminary sketch. Anyway, so I had decided that this sort of bigger plot bead, the general kind of action of the main part of the play is that, you know, the two women are speculating, gossiping. They are prodding and poking around. And basically, they don't really understand it as such, but they're investigating, right? And, you know, they're running a bit of an investigation, a side investigation, parallel to the men's, although I don't think either of these women would define it as such. And that is punctuated or interrupted, or I would say punctuated actually in first, by the discovery of the quilting basket. And so I'm going to sort of make a little banner here to show that this kind of, you know, is part of the scene, but also is a sort of, stands out from the scene, right? So I'm going to make a little, like, kind of bit of a, and this is just my own decision. This isn't really, you could make a different kind of symbol if you wanted to, but this made sense to me. So we have the discovering of the quilting basket. And, you know, they're kind of speculating about whether or not Minnie was planning to quilt it or not it. And, of course, the men overhear her as they return, and they tease them. So I'm going to kind of, this is an interruption of this bit here of the circle. So I'm going to kind of make the circle in half, because this first return of the men, which is a return that is a kind of, the men sort of pass through, right, is a moment that really sort of interrupts what the women are doing. So the men return, they tease the women, and they exit again to the outside. And then the scene between the women starts up again. And it's more of the same. They continue to sort of gossip and speculate. And what we have next is the discovery of the nervous stitches, which is really basically clue number one for the women, right? Remember? So we're going to mark that out also with a banner. Sorry for my handwriting there. I'm going to call this clue number one. And then what we get next is the discovery of the bird cage, just a few bits later. And I'm going to call this clue number two. Okay, so we have clue number two. And then once they've discovered the bird cage and they realize that, Minnie may have bought a bird. They start, talking a bit more about her and John, and they share their low opinion of John, who seems to have been something of a bastard, certainly a mean guy, abuser probably. And then they have the big discovery, so I'm going to make this a slightly larger box because they have this major discovery of the dead bird, right? And this is clue number 3. And right after they discover the bird, the men return to interrupt them once again. And guess what the men do? They tease the women. And the women, and this is why this for me is a new bead, because the women now do something new, right? They basically cover up the bird. And they also kind of make up a little bit of a story about a cat that doesn't exist. So they're really kind of withholding some information from the men. And that's a kind of new thing for the women because they're taking a different kind of action. And now the men exit upstairs again. So we're going to give them another arrow. And then we have this next moment for the women, which is also really important, where they start to share an understanding of Minnie's pain and of Minnie's trauma. And, they also start to question what constitutes justice in this case, right? Because they begin to realize that there may have been a different crime committed that the people weren't aware of. And as the women are talking about, and sharing this, the men return once again and interrupt them. And this time the men are saying, and the women overhear them, if only we had a motive, right? And when the men are in the room with the women, there is a sort of cursory inspection of what they are planning to take to Minnie. And, predictably, the men say, oh, there's nothing dangerous here, because they are blind to it, right? And so the men exit again. Now to look at the windows. And that was a terrible arrow. Forgive me for that. And now the women do something that's kind of exciting, which is they hide the bird. And I'm going to give that a kind of exciting shape. So I'm going to give that a sort of jaggedy shape. That seems a kind of important thing to happen. The men return. Once again, they ridicule the women, asking, is she going to quilt it or not it? And then we have this little sort of audio joke at the end of the play where the women answer, not it. And of course, there's a bit of a pun here, right? Because they say not it. But what we might hear is not it, like it's not, you're not getting it, men. So here we have the entirety of the play Trifles all on one page. We've got the plot that we can see all on one page. And that's a goal of doing a plot beat diagram, is to capture everything that happens in the play on one page, so that you can kind of get a sense of the whole of it, of its rhythm, of its emotional energy. So one of the reasons why I, chose, I could have made different choices here, obviously. I made the choice, as I said, as we were doing the annotation, to make this entire sort of scene, this big scene, all one coherent whole. I could have done something different. I could have sort of decided to break this up into, a bead, a round bead for the first bit of, gossiping, and then a square for the first discovery, and, more discussion, the men enter, and then more discussion, clue one, more discussion, clue two, more discussion, clue three, and I could have sort of built this out as a series of beads. But to me, it was really important to kind of think of this play as, in terms of its, that the women's investigation is kind of a piece, and it sort of builds through these moments of discovery, and that our next real bead comes when they have the cover up of the bird, because that to me seems like a kind of new action for the women, whereas the poking and prodding and investigating and gossiping and speculating all is kind of the same action that just keeps kind of taking new evidence into account. But you might have made a different decision, and then you would have a different play, right? And that's okay, because this is an art and not a science. I also could have made a different choice, for example, here, where I made this sort of jaggedy shape, right? And, I wanted to sort of call out the fact that, the women hiding the bird is actually a pretty exciting thing for them to do, and it's also a pretty exciting thing for us to see as an audience. But we could have made that a circle if we wanted to, or an oval, or it could have been a square. It might have been, I could have made it I could have done it in a different color. I could have done all sorts of things. You'll see that I tried to sort of write into each of these beads what's happening in the bead, but I also don't want to put too much language in it. And, if I were not doing this on an electronic device, I probably could be a lot neater with it too, and I would want to be a little neater with it. Doing a plot bead diagram can give you insights into the play that you might not have gotten just from a reading of the play. So, for example, one of the things that I can see from this plot bead diagram, and I think anybody who looks at it could see, is that there's a bit of there's a pattern to it that is pretty readily discernible. It's discernible from reading the play, but it really becomes visible from the plot bead diagram, which is that, the men are constantly coming in and out. And mostly what they do is they trivialize what the women are up to, right? They show themselves to be blind to all of the things of importance that are happening in the domestic space of the kitchen. And the play is structured to really reveal that. So, we have here the men, first of all, we have this prologue where we have an establishment of the men as the authority, right? The county attorney is questioning Mr. Hale, then he's questioning Mrs. Hale, and he's establishing himself as somebody who's, really trying to get to the truth of things. And yet we also sort of already have, this kind of hint that he's not really going to be able to see what's important when he, sort of notices the fruit and the dirty towels, but he can't really understand their significance, right? Whereas the women can. And then we have this series all the way through here where the women are noticing all sorts of details, and the men keep coming in and, ridiculing, teasing, dismissing everything that the women might sort of see as being important, right? And so the quilting is unimportant, the bird is unimportant. Even though they start to the men are curious about where the bird might have gone, they don't really see it as anything that could possibly be significant, whereas the women are understanding the significance of all these details. And of course, this, plays out the title of the play, Trifles. The women kind of, understand how trifles can add up to something much bigger, and the men are, sort of searching, high and low in all the wrong places. They keep going in and out. And so we see this kind of constant interruption of the action by these, arrows of the men going in and out and in and out again. So this, in a sense, is our plot bead diagram of Trifles. And I hope this was helpful to you as a demonstration for how you might make your own, do your own attempt at diagramming. Again, this is an art, not a science. There's not really a right way to do it or a wrong way to do it. And it's something that, the doing of it, the drawing of it is, a method to help you sort of start to understand and see the rhythm and the structure of the play and the way it maps out its action over time. Now I want to turn to a variant on the plot bead diagram, and this is what I'll call the Orr approach to plot beading. Shelley Orr, a professor of dramaturgy at San Diego State University, has developed this variation. Similarly to Scanlan, the goal here is to make a visual diagram that charts the time events of the play in order. But instead of using abstract shapes, this approach calls for the use of icons to symbolize the elements of action you wish to track. With this method, you invent or devise small icons, beads, that stand in for elements that recur, such as plot events, themes, blocking, bits of dialogue, sound cues, etc. And where the Scanlan method can be used for a whole play or to drill down into smaller time units, this method is often best used to focus in on a part of a play, an act or a scene. It can be used to track certain elements throughout an entire play, but because this method requires isolating icons that indicate things that recur, often we find that those elements occur more in one act or in one scene than across an entire play. These plot bead diagrams are great for revealing patterns at work in the play that are not evident on first reading. So here are a couple of examples, and both of these have been drawn by me. Here you have my plot bead diagram of the first act of Romeo and Juliet, and I'm going to quickly explain to you what you see here. So the first icon that I have here is what I'm going to call a bro bump. Those are two fists bumping. The reason why I chose this icon is because when I reread the first act of Romeo and Juliet, second wave feminist that I am, I noticed that a lot of that act has to do with guys bragging to each other about women and getting into fights and insulting each other, and it all felt very bro-y to me. And so I saw in all of these scenes repeated incidents of young men peacocking and competing with each other and acting in ways that felt quite stereotypically hetero-masculine. The two swords crossing indicate fighting, and so if you remember Romeo and Juliet from the 9th grade, you'll remember that the play starts with the Capulet servants boasting and doing all this bro sort of penis humor, and then they have a fight, and then the fight escalates. So you can see that I've beaded that out with these two things, and then the prince intervenes, and what I've got is sort of a band symbol over the two swords to show that he says no more fighting. And then we have a moment in the first scene in which the Montague family's concerns regarding Romeo are revealed, and it's a moment of exposition, so I use the family crest as my symbol for exposition of backstory about families. And you can see that I used an M to indicate this is the Montague family, and R for Romeo, and this is the male, and that this also has to do with love. And then we have another moment of bro talk, Benvolio and Romeo, because he loves the wrong girl. And then our second scene, we start out with a couple more bro moments, Capulet to Paris, let's go check out all the girls at the party. And then we have Benvolio and Romeo, and the gist of the scene is let's go check out all the girls at the party. And then we have a scene in which the Capulet family, we get their exposition about their history. And we have a moment where the nurse or the mother says to Juliet, you need to check out Paris at the party. So we're getting a little bit of patterning here that you can see. And then the fourth scene in the first act, the Montague men are headed out for the party, and Romeo foreshadows doom. So I cheated a little bit, and I introduced a new symbol, which is Romeo in a rain cloud. This is Benvolio, this is Mercutio, so the initials indicate characters. And then in the fifth scene of the first act, we have the party scene, and we have Romeo falling in love. We have Romeo and Tybalt wanting to fight, and Lord Capulet intervenes, and then Juliet falls in love, and then we end up that these two are enemies, and so there's the banning symbol here. And so this is my beating out, using icons, the first act of Romeo and Juliet. And so the guidelines for this kind of plot bead are that you want to prioritize. You want to limit the number of elements and icons to only 5 or 6. You don't want a proliferation of things because it becomes overwhelming, and you want to make decisions about what's important. Prioritize. That's important. You want to take care in selecting your icons. You want to make them distinct and representative. You don't have to be great at drawing to do this. I actually had to look up how to draw a bro bump, and I had to practice it a few times. But it's a very distinctive symbol, and it says exactly what I wanted to say. Two guys, bumping fists. Hearts are always good for love. Symbols that are recognizable are always helpful. The diagram should fit comfortably on one page. You want to make it comprehensive, but also simple and clear enough to be useful. This is another reason why limiting the scope and going act by act might be helpful for one of these plot bead diagrams, so you don't have too much. You don't want to have this enormous amount of information on one page. You can make it horizontal or vertical. I chose to make mine horizontal, but one could do a vertical plot bead as Scanlan does. You need to include a title, which is what I have here, and a key to the symbols, showing what each of your icons stands for. And there are variations that are available. You can use a band symbol or use upside down or inversion to double a symbol's usefulness. So we have the fighting here, and then we have the ban on fighting. And you can do what I did here and also add text to help clarify what's going on in the scene. It's not necessary, but I often find it useful to do, and I found it useful in this plot bead diagram. Here's another example of a diagram. This one is Our Town, Act 1. Again, this is one of mine, and you can see I have my key down here. So I've got a book that stands for the stage manager narrating. I got a milk bottle and a newspaper, which is my symbol for small town daily life. And I have a little picket fence, and that symbolizes the Gibbs and Webb families, and then the heart is George and Emily's sort of budding romance in the first act. And so you can see that one of the patterns that emerges in looking at this plot bead is that we have a lot of going back and forth between the narration, small town daily life, and these picket fence moments between the two families. Picket fence, narration, and sometimes the narration is longer and bigger. That means it takes up more time. And other times the narration is smaller because there are smaller moments. In general, these moments of daily life seem to be punctuating at regular intervals throughout the act. And then we can see that there's a whole long segment in which we don't see that kind of thing. So the aim of the plot bead diagram is to give a focused view of particular aspects of the play. So here, for example, I was interested in the question, what's the function of the narrator in Act 1? Where does he come in, and where can I see if there is some rhythm to it? And I wanted to see whether I could discern that by plot beading it out like this. You want to be thorough, but this is not an exercise in being complete or comprehensive. You don't have to capture everything. You want to focus on the things that you're interested in. As I wrap this demo up, I want to emphasize that the process of making a plot bead diagram is a process of engaging in artistic decision making. So this should be enjoyable to anybody who's interested in making theater, because it's a way of making decisions ahead of time about how you are imagining the play unspooling in front of an audience over time. What's the rhythm? What is going to have more emphasis? What's going to feel like a bigger moment? Can you draw that so that when you later look at this page, you remind yourself that you've made a decision that something needs more emphasis? It's a really useful tool because not only can it help you focus your thinking about a given play, but it also can help convey your ideas to collaborators and form a basis for conversations with other members of your creative team. The beauty of the plot bead diagram as a tool is that it often reveals something that you didn't notice the first time you read the play. So when we look at your diagrams in class, I'll ask you to attend to that question. What do you know now about the play that you didn't know before you did the plot bead diagram? And the last thing I'll say about this is have fun. Remember, this is an art, not a science. So let your artistic instincts guide you. Don't be worried that you've done it wrong. Don't be worried that you can't draw. If you really feel terrible about your drafting skills, you can always use clip art or use shapes that you find in a drawing program, or you can take photographs of little shapes if you want and make them really small. However it is that you want to do this so that you can use your shapes and use your icons in a way that's most useful to you. So have fun with it. I look forward to seeing them, and I'll see you in class soon.